All right, everyone. So this is lecture 5 in the causes of the American Revolution. I've titled this lecture, Why Didn't the Revolution Start in 1763? Republicanism. And I've asked that question pretty much because at the end of the French and Indian War, as we learnt last time, uh, the American colonists weren't looking that great. They had lost salutary neglect. It was very, very obvious that the British were more interested in the land rather than the colonists. And so we can start to question, why did the revolution start so long after the end of French and Indian War? Um, you know, wouldn't they have just been able to realize the fact that, the monarch was kind of taking away their liberty? That's the question. And I've put the image of King George III from 1765 there because we're going to learn, how republicanism actually helped the colonists make sense of what was occurring in America under the monarch. And it's a very interesting, juxtaposition or comparison between the two political regimes, republicanism and monarchism. And what we'll find is that republicanism really subdued a lot of what the Americans could have done in 1763, but it also will be one of the leading causes to the revolution at the end of the day. The last time what we did was we covered the French and Indian War, and we covered some of the key consequences of that war, mainly, specifically for our lecture today, the fact that Britain's intent for America became really self-evident. The Britons put colonists in a deadly position for the sake of their own wealth, and they wanted to gain as much wealth out of that pocket of land that was in dispute, and that was mercantilism coming up once again. The other thing that came up was the Proclamation Act, which ended up salutary neglect. That Proclamation Act by King George III told the Americans, you're not allowed to go past this line. And so that is challenging their right to certain property on the land. But we also noticed that as a short-term consequence of the French and Indian War was imperial pride. The monarch had protected his people. King George III had done everything in his power to defend the colonists. And so we've got this really weird kind of scenario where, the British are being bittersweet. They're taking stuff away from the colonists, but they're also protecting the colonists in the process. Today's learning intentions are to be able to explain and analyze, using your knowledge of pre-revolution context in America, how republicanism challenged King George III and the monarchy. And you should also be able to explain and analyze, using your knowledge of republicanism, why the American Revolution did not begin in 1763. Now, this lecture isn't directly taken from the textbook. Rather, this is coming from more suggested reading from Gordon Wood, one of our reliable historians on this topic. And I've actually put that reading as an attachment on the Google Classroom. And if you come up with any questions at all, feel free to post them on the Google Classroom and I'll be able to answer them for you. But that reading, just pages 13 to 16, will give you some insight into where this lecture is coming from, and you'll get more information about republicanism. Now, just coming back to this slide that I showed you guys, the short-term and long-term consequences of the French and Indian War were such that, Britain had put the colonists in a deadly position. There was end of salutary neglect, but there was imperial pride. And so I kind of put a question mark over, what does this mean for the British? And wouldn't the end of salutary neglect and wouldn't the Britons putting the colonists in a deadly position be a trigger for the revolution? What is actually occurring here? And look, I've made a timeline for us because we need to kind of see how this is all kind of taking place. Up the top, above the line is the causes, and below the line is the consequences. So we see, the British landing in Jamestown in 1607 to colonize America, and the consequence of that is that Britain is going to start its British mercantilist policy down the bottom here. And we can see throughout the 1600s and 1700s, the British mercantilist policy running right through. We see the Enlightenment leading to natural law, natural rights, which we've learnt about, and that era kind of coming to an end in 1700, and everything between that 1600 and 1700, we see, the Dominion of New England, which we heard about, the overthrow of King James, and the Glorious Revolution, which consequently gave us the British Constitution, or the Bill of Rights, which was created using natural rights philosophy of liberty, life, and property. And so the American colonists who are coming over throughout the 1600s into the 1700s, they know about those natural rights, those natural freedoms of liberty, life, and property. And then after 1700, kind of when the Enlightenment kind of concludes, we see the start of the French Indian War, followed by that, and that consequently creates the Albany Plan of Union. The French Indian War concludes with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, and that consequently creates the Proclamation Act, where King George isn't allowing the colonists to move anywhere past a certain divide in the American or North America, and that consequently creates the end of salutary neglect. And what I've done, or I've tried to communicate in this timeline, is Enlightenment leading to natural law and rights. It continues along throughout the 1700s, and it hits a speed bump when it hits the end of salutary neglect with the Proclamation Act. And likewise, we got the British mercantilist policy in American colonies continuing all the way from the 1600s all the way through the 1700s, and it's just kind of murmuring underneath the surface of all this stuff. And we come to this kind of moment in American history in 1763, where there is no salutary neglect anymore. There is a really strong British mercantilist policy. We kind of have to question, well, what's the role of liberty? We've talked about liberty a lot in this class, and we know that liberty is going to be one of the main causes of the American Revolution. How do the Americans justify their liberty in this circumstance where it seems really obvious that they have no liberty, they have no property, and they have no life? What is going on here? Why don't the Americans begin revolutionary action in 1763? Well, my answer to that is this idea of republicanism. So what we have to be really clear about is the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights, through the overthrow of King James, is created, and it's created using, again, the idea of natural rights, property, liberty, life. That's its foundation. And out of that comes this idea of republicanism in the American colonies, this idea that each citizen was required to display what is called civic virtue, and thus had a role to play in keeping their society stable. If the ruler became a tyrant, it was the most able and most civically virtuous citizens to overthrow them and replace them with a better system or candidate. So that's what really happens in the Glorious Revolution. We see, the British working together. However, there is a tyrant in King James rising up, and the British civilians or citizens overthrow King James because they realize that he is not looking out for the best of civic virtue. Civic virtue, I've put there, is a political theory that society can avoid tyranny, if everyone acts in the interest of the society and not individual interest. And that's what King James was doing. He was tyrannically acting out of self-interest. And republicanism is this idea that everyone can get along so long as everyone is looking after each other. And if there is a tyrant that rises up, then we can topple them if we all remain together. And that is really a product. That idea is really a product of the Bill of Rights, and it becomes kind of the political system within America. So a Republican citizen would possess land, okay? So naturally, they would have to have some kind of feeling of ownership in the society, and ownership came with the possession of land. A Republican citizen would always seek the good for the public, and by doing so, they would be able to identify if there is a tyrant leading them or governing them, and a Republican citizen would have the power to overthrow. They would be able to, raise the alarm and actually overthrow, just like they did in the Glorious Revolution, King James from being a tyrant. So naturally, that means that a Republican citizen would have a property, they would know what the good life was, and they would understand that their natural liberties. And that's what natural rights is. Natural rights is saying that you are entitled to life, liberty, and property, and that is exactly what the Republican citizen in this case has. Now, if the Republican citizen would have a property, they know what the good life was, and understand their natural liberties, then the American has in 1763 a new property because of the Treaty of Paris. The treaty has given the Americans that ability to actually take back some of the land that was originally the French, and they're able to use that land for specific purposes that the British want them to use it for, to use those natural resources. But ultimately, the Americans have gained that land, and that's great. The second thing is that the American in 1763 has a monarch that has protected their life. And, that is, in their opinion, a good scenario. Whilst certain things such as solitary neglect or being put at risk or at danger of being, killed is a bad thing, ultimately, they're still got their lives. They have lived throughout the French and Indian War, and the monarch has come in and made sure that they're protected. So they're living a good life. And finally, the American has in 1763 the English Bill of Rights. The Republican citizen understands their natural liberties, and the American citizen in 1763 has that Bill of Rights. They do understand their natural liberties. They do have the ability to actually overthrow the monarch if they really want to. But why would they? They've got their property, they've got a good life, and they do have that ability to overthrow. So really, they are still within the bounds of natural rights. And republicanism is this concept for them. It's their way of understanding their life within the guidelines of the British Bill of Rights. They are British citizens, but they live in America. They live distant. They live far away from the British, and so republicanism really makes it obvious to them that they are still entitled to all this stuff, and it also makes it really clear to them, when a specific government system is going beyond or going past the line. So naturally, the American in 1763 has natural rights. They also have imperial pride. They've just won this war alongside the British. They were active in supporting the war because they saved the British General Braddock when he was about to be killed. The New England expedition saved him in that process, and they were really instrumental in making sure that the British won against the French. So they've got this sense of ownership, this sense of imperial pride. They belong to the empire. And finally, they have their freedom. They're no longer at threat from the French. They've made this proclamation, or King George has come in and put an end to the threat of the Native Americans, because he's made this very clear line or divide between the Americans and the Native Americans. Sorry, I should say the colonists and the Native Americans. And so the colonists have a freedom in America. So my question is not why wouldn't they? It is, why would the Americans begin revolutionary actions in 1763? They really don't have any purpose to. This idea of republicanism is really kind of mellowed out possible other tensions, and is really confirmed to the Americans, yeah, we do still have rights. Yes, King George is acting and he's kind of dictating to us exactly where we can and can't go, and it became really obvious to us that really the British just want money from us, and that's why we're here. But ultimately, we still have life, we still have liberty, and we still have property in the process. So republicanism, the cause is the Enlightenment and natural rights or law. That is the main cause of the Republican movement coming about. The trigger, obviously, is the Glorious Revolution when King James is overthrown. So Enlightenment and natural rights and law give the British in that time an understanding of what they're entitled to. They see King James violating that, and so they overthrow him throughout the Glorious Revolution. And another trigger of republicanism is the creation of the English Bill of Rights or the British Constitution. And whilst that's not a formal document, it's still a theoretical framework for them to work in. A short-term consequence of republicanism is imperial pride, and republicanism becomes synonymous with monarchy. For some of the Americans, it's quite difficult for them to actually define what republicanism is. John Adams says republicanism may signify anything, everything, or nothing. And so in that moment, they can't really differentiate between the idea of monarchy and republicanism, except for the fact that, the Americans aren't living in the actual country where King George lives. They live distant from him, and they're working for him, but they still live under that monarchy system, and they still are able to maintain or retain their own life, liberty, and property. Now, a long-term consequence of republicanism, what we're going to find down the track, is that this idea that makes it really, really, it makes the Americans really sure of what they're entitled to, ends up challenging the monarch. It challenges King George III, and he can already kind of see this occurring. He realizes that republicanism brings the Americans together. It reassures them as to what they're entitled to. It gives them a certain power, and knowing all this and seeing such a population boom, he kind of starts questioning whether or not he's able to maintain a certain amount of power over America. But that's a long-term thing. The Republican movement, didn't just replace monarchy during the Revolution. It ate away at it. It corroded it. Gordon Wood said, it ate away, it corroded it, it slowly, gradually, and steadily replaced monarchy in America. But for right now, after the French and Indian War, it was just another political way of life. But it will end up challenging the monarch. And the last long-term consequence is that it actually creates the role of Republican Whigs and the Tories or the monarchs. And that's, in a nutshell, in Australia we have the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, and that's the same thing. We've got the Whigs and the Tories in America themselves. And so we kind of have this Republican political ideology and this monarch political ideology, and they're not the same. The monarchs are really concerned for law and order under King George, and the Republicans are really concerned for liberty and independence. And that's how, there's always going to be that dispute, just like in our own government where there's Labor and Liberal. There's always going to be that dispute. And I guess that's where republicanism is most on show, is when in the colonial assemblies there are certain Whigs and there are certain Tories, and they want to debate and dispute these possible legislations that are being introduced over time to the Americans from the British Crown. But we're going to talk more about the Whigs and the Tories throughout the lead up into the Revolution itself. Okay, so that's republicanism. I hope that helps with making you guys understand why the revolution didn't occur. And I guess for your benefit, it's going to help you guys, instead of referring to natural rights and law and the Enlightenment, from now on, you can just refer to republicanism, because republicanism, encompassed all those things and more within a political framework. Next time, we're going to look at how the empire manages an economic crisis. I explained to you guys that one of the consequences of the French and Indian War was the vast amount of money that it cost Britain to defend America. And so we're going to see how the empire, which includes America, is going to manage this economic crisis. And we're going to see 4 acts: the Sugar Act, Currency Act, Mutiny Act, and the notorious Stamp Act.